Here in Module 4, we're taking a focus on offenders and what impact restorative justice procedures, as one example, or an important example of community justice innovation, what impact those style of reforms and innovations have on the offenders themselves. Next week we will look at victims and other stakeholders, but for this week we're really focusing on specifically on the offenders. And with any sort of work in criminal justice or public policy anywhere, it's always important to be able to use research to show the efficacy of your interventions, of your strategies, of your innovations, to be able to show what worked and what didn't. So what we'll look at here is what research has been done particularly into the ideas of reoffending and desistance, and we'll look at the difference between those concepts later on in this particular workshop, this particular video, but also to look at how robust is the research, because there are a lot of pressures on maintenance of the existing criminal justice system, of increasing the severity of punishment. Many of you I know have done assignments on this in previous criminology subjects, but there's been traditionally a very strong set of interests organised against these sort of innovations, and a lot of pressure from media in particular to get harsher penalties. This idea that offenders have it too easy and the only way forward is to give them harsher penalties, and that's been a substantive area of discussion throughout your criminology studies. We're not going to revisit that, except to note overall that there's very little evidence that harsher penalties achieve much of anything. In many cases, there's an irony that harsher penalties actually increases the chance of someone reoffending, and plenty of evidence that the causes of criminality are much more complicated than can be managed by a simple incentive model of deterrence, of higher penalties, higher pain equals less likelihood of reoffending. We know that many offenders are young, in the 18 to 20 age group, where their brains haven't finished developing, particularly the areas of the brain that govern impulse control. We also have emerging evidence that a large number of offenders have acquired brain injuries, and brain injuries over the areas of the brain that cover impulse control, planning, and so on. And even worse, that many of the older offenders are acquiring those brain injuries inside the criminal justice system, in police custody or in prison. So any of these simplistic ideas that the way to solve crime is to give harsher penalties, longer sentences, or whatever, we have as a discipline, criminology has pretty much debunked. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that other models are necessarily better, or that don't have their own problems and difficulties. And there is always the chance that these restorative justice ideas will be worse. So we need to actually do the hard work to collect the research, gather the data, and to continually reflect on what that means. As an early indicator, before we get into the different specific studies, indications are generally that for some types of crime, restorative justice is a much, much better approach. But even for the situations where it's not a better approach, it's definitely no worse. So overall, for all the areas that we've studied so far, restorative justice is the strongest approach when compared to the conventional approaches. The one area we really haven't looked into very terribly deeply at the moment is issues such as sexual violence, and that's a different discussion. And there are certainly indications that sexual violence is in its causes and the way it's treated in the resultant victims is substantially different to crime generally or violence generally, and deserves a separate discussion and a separate category. So far there hasn't been a big push to use restorative justice approaches where there's sexual violence, and I think if people are being cautious in that area. They don't want victims of sexual assault to be further victimised, but that doesn't necessarily mean that eventually we might not figure out that it works in that field as well. We're just being very careful. All right, so I'm going to run through a few different surveys, studies that have been done on large scale in different jurisdictions and what they've found. The methodology that's used throughout most of these, almost all of these approaches, is the randomized control trial, which is where you take a group of like subjects and you randomly sort them into different groups, and you have a control group that you can compare to the experimental group. I'm sure you've done that in your criminology research unit or your psychology research units before, so you should be very familiar with that idea. So you're comparing like for like, you're comparing young property offenders to other young property offenders. Some go through the conventional system, some go through the restorative justice theme system, and you compare the outcomes. It's a reasonably solid, sound, accepted approach. There are some difficulties with using it, and it's largely down to the fact that, you know, in the area of crime, it is very hard to say what is like for like. Cases are so different that you could take everyone who's accused of assault and randomly distribute them, but the facts that lead to the charge of assault can be so variable, they can come from such different contexts, that it can be quite difficult to ensure that you are actually sorting similar cases together to do that sort of randomized trial. And, you know, one of the if you're going to look at comparisons across the board between offenders going through conventional process and restorative justice processes, one of the big differences is that restorative justice only happens with the consent of the offender, and often with the consent of the victim, and generally happens when an offender has pleaded guilty to an offence. So if you're going to compare those people to people in the conventional justice system who may have pled to an offence, may not have, you've already got a substantial difference. You've already got offenders who are showing contrition, they're showing remorse or whatever, who are going to this program that marks them out as different. So we have to be careful of those sorts of things, and there is a sense in which there's a self-selecting bias in the process, that the people who are going into the restorative justice systems are more likely to be people who will benefit from them. That being said, we'll have a look at what the different projects found. There's a couple of other concepts in terms of research that come up here that are worth making sure that you know about. The first is meta-analysis. So it's become a much more popular form of research. I think as research has become more expensive and research grants have been harder to get, a meta-analysis is something that you can just do with your library account. You don't have to go out and do any independent research, but a meta-analysis is where you integrate multiple sources of data, multiple research fields, multiple studies, and integrate them within one document. It's also really popular, I think, because, you know, the scale of academic research grows every year. You know, there was at one point, maybe in the 1920s, where if you're a criminologist, you could keep up with pretty much everything that was happening in publishing in criminology, but that day has long gone. And every year we add another set of thousands of research articles to the field. So a meta-analysis is also really useful in being able to give people a way in to all this data, an overview of that existing data. So there are important meta-analyses that have occurred in this study of this data that are referred to in your notes. The other research term that's worth knowing about is variation research. which works similar to your randomized control groups, but it's using a smaller subset of the data. So in this case, a variation research might only look at the offenders who are already in the restorative justice system and compare their outcomes based on the different ways they were treated, or the differences in process, or the differences of offender profile within the restorative justice system. So you don't get the advantage of saying, you know, this is how the old system worked, this is how the new system worked, but you're also not contending with those problems of that self-selecting bias, and you're actually drilling down much more closely on the concept of what worked and what didn't, based on the specific differences of people in that group. So be aware, the notes mentions variation research a bit, and that's where you're not trying to randomize everything, you're trying to focus in more deeply. All right, so I'll go through a few of the different forms of research that have been done, different research projects. The big one in Australia is RISE, R-I-S-E, the Reintegrative Shaming Experiment. It was the first large-scale experiment on restorative justice in Australia. It was very much based on John Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming approach, which we talked about last week. And they looked at offenders in only a few areas of crime: property crime, violent crime, and drink driving. And they looked at people who went to restorative justice conferencing or court, and looked at the outcomes at the end of the day in terms of reoffending. They looked at the rates of reoffending over 12 months. They found that there was a significant decrease in the violent offenders, that the restorative justice processes worked reasonably well for violent offenders, but there was only a small decrease in drink driving offences, and no difference at all for juvenile property offences or shoplifters. So already we're seeing a pattern that seems to show that this is really an approach that works best for violent offences, and it helps prevent reoffending there. But in other areas, particularly property crime, it may not be as effective. It's certainly no worse than the conventional approaches, but it may be that if property offences are caused by something that's not within the control of the offender, if they're really based around disadvantage and need, then maybe no matter how well adjusted you are and how well a restorative justice process goes, you'll soon find yourself in a situation where stealing becomes a viable option again. So that's interesting. The next one is the BRPE, the Bethlehem Restorative Policing Experiment, based in the US, not in the Middle East. And again, they looked at property crime and violent crime amongst young offenders. And they found there was a significant decrease amongst violent offenders, but no difference amongst property offenders. So again, from a meta-analysis perspective, we've got a pattern emerging. We've got a very clear idea that these things are really good for property, for violence, but less effective in terms of property. We also have the Indianapolis Juvenile Restoration Justice Experiment, also known in slightly shorter form as the IJRJE. This is the Indiana Juvenile Justice Experiments. Again, they looked at first-time violent offenders, and they looked at a long-term set of figures, much longer than the other studies, and they found that there was a 50% reduction. And remember, this is just violence; this is not other forms of crime. That they found a 50% reduction in rearrest for 6 months, about 30% over 12 months. And there was some indication of a declining effect over 24 months. And by 12 years later, there was no real difference at all between the people who'd been through the restorative and the conventional justice systems. Of course, when we're talking about people offending, often their criminal careers are sort of 18 to 25, maybe a little later. So it's probably not surprising that after 12 years, there's not going to be much difference in the figures, because the figure's going to be low in both sets, although people who've been institutionalised, imprisoned, or whatever else tend to be higher in any case. And finally, we've got the Justice Research Consortium, the JRC. It's a UK approach. What did they look at? They looked at adult offenders. That was different in that case. Most of the others looked at young offenders, and they said that there were reductions in the frequency of reoffending across the board. Not as great as for the juvenile offenders, but there was a reasonably strong decrease in reoffence for the restorative justice processes. So overall, we're seeing that for young offenders involved in violence, these processes overall are pretty good, but there are no situations where the traditional system is actually better. You know, at the very worst, we can show that there's really no difference, and those generally speaking, in the situations where there are other circumstances that may contribute to offending. So, you know, in the case of the property crimes, it may be that if you're still come out of the system with no hope and no opportunities, you're still going to be pressured towards crime. And with the drunk driving situation, it may be that if addiction is driving that behaviour, then having a one-off conferencing session where you are terribly remorseful about what you've done may not make a whole lot of difference if there's addictive behaviour at the core of it. And one of the things a lot of the researchers are at pains to point out to us is that when it comes to restorative justice, it's usually just one session. Or in fact, I guess when we talk about conventional justice, you know, appearing before a judge or magistrate, that's sort of one session as well. But when we're talking about, you know, someone going into the restorative justice process, we should be really careful not to overstate our expectations. And people can really sincerely want to change their ways. They can really see the results of what they've done. They might want to, you know, redeem the harm that they've done and repair the breach. However, that's a one-off experience that can vanish over time. And if you don't have ongoing contact, you don't have a system of repair within the social system itself, where the person the offender is regularly made contact with, of course it's going to wear off over time. So that is something to be aware of. Someone who is put into custody in a prison sentence, there's going to be continuing contact with them by the system, for good or bad. I mean, it goes both ways. Sometimes the programs in the systems help, and people are less likely to reoffend when they leave. Other times, the very nature of imprisonment leads to further criminality. You know, we talked about the acquired brain injuries earlier, or we've got criminal subcultures that people meet in prison, or we've got the lack of autonomy that comes from imprisonment that stops people developing their own strong sense of self. There's all those kinds of reasons that imprisonment, even though there's regular contact with the offender, may actually increase the chances of reoffending. But when we're talking about restorative justice, we're generally just talking about these sort of one-off programs. And someone can agree to go into anger management or counselling. And in fact, the rates of compliance with those sort of agreements is really quite high. You might think that someone, you know, in a conferencing session will go, yeah, I'll go do anger management, and then they won't do it. No, we've actually found that the rates are actually very high of people following through and actually doing what they've committed to do. But we're also talking about, you know, only one influence and one factor on people's lives over a great many. Okay, so we're continuing with our research, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago. You know, this approach to justice is reasonably new. It really only started to come together in the mid-70s. So we've only really got about 50 years of it happening, and it was pretty slow starting. So we don't have a huge body of research, but we are getting more and more all the time. There are more and more restorative justice programs being implemented, and there's better and better data coming out. So we're finding out more and more, and it's, you know, the evidence is pretty strong. We're going to look at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre in the next couple of weeks in Collingwood in Victoria, and that's a really interesting pilot program in Australia that's been extremely successful in reducing rates of crime in the community. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is reoffending and desistance. That's referred to a few times in the materials, and I just wanted to clarify the difference. Desistance is a reasonably new concept in criminology. In the past, we really talked about reoffending more than anything else, and these days it's more common to talk about desistance. And in both cases, we're looking at crime rates, and we're looking at whether people reoffend further down the track. So why is it different? Why do we even talk about something different to reoffending? And it's actually about adopting a different lens to understanding criminality. And again, you might have covered this in other courses, so I don't want to belabor the point. But the traditional reoffending model looks at the factors that cause a person to commit crime, and what can be done to influence those factors to stop them reoffending. So, you know, if there's someone who's poor, can we support them in learning a way of making a living that they, you know, are no longer resorting to crime? If there's someone who has anger management issues, can we give them anger management training to stop them committing crime? The perspective of desistance is quite different, and in that it looks at what are the strengths that prevent someone from being an offender. So we're not looking at their deficits, we're looking at what their strengths are and what can we do to bolster their strengths. So I'm no expert on positive psychology, but I can see there's a certain synergy with positive psychology. And as an approach, it's more about building up someone's ability to be a citizen, to be responsible, to make responsible actions than it is necessarily to get rid of the negative factors and negative influences. So desistance is something that has been a field of study independent of restorative justice, independent of mediation or conferencing or anything else, but it's definitely something that it has synergies that is consistent with restorative justice. There's a theorist called Maruna who has said that under the old system, bad choices of atomized individuals are transformed in the new system to a more collectivist understanding that crime is enmeshed in social networks and relationships. So again, it's less about the pathology of the individual, more about, well, where do they sit in society? What's around them? What are the factors around them? And how can we use the strengths that these individuals have as human beings? How can we help them cultivate those strengths? How can we help them become people who are not tempted into crime, who are not following violence as an impulse, as a reaction that they see as, you know, a suitable reaction to a stimulus. Desistance looks at the role. There's a whole interesting study of the use of narrative in desistance and how people telling stories about themselves and their life journeys become really important. And there's an interesting documentary, I'm not sure if it's on any of the streaming services, called Inmate Number One, about the actor Danny Trejo. And if you know who Danny Trejo is, he's an awesome sort of alternative Hollywood actor who gets cast as bad guys a lot. But Danny Trejo is someone who, you know, was a drug addict, has been to prison, as a result, spent most of his acting career being cast as inmate number 1, hence the name of the doco. But it's an interesting look at how those stories of redemption, how other people helping him on his journey to kick his addiction and to become a member of society impacted on him and his need to do that for others. So the last thing I want to leave you with is a argument from Suzuki and Jenkins. That's our very own Masahiro. Argues that desistance and restorative justice have several things in common, but one of the important things is they both have an emphasis on support for identity transformation. This can be done by self-forgiveness as a catalyst. Restorative justice can help achieve self-forgiveness by encouraging offenders to take responsibility for what they've done, to feel shame, feel guilt, feel remorse, and to offer compensation. Self-forgiveness can then, in turn, help to achieve identity transformation. So potentially very, very powerful stuff. Again, if you're on Fox News or Facebook, they're going to have none of this. They believe in, criminals are evil and deserve to be punished. But we've had 200 years of trying that and it hasn't worked. And I think what we're starting to see is an emergence of a very practical understanding of how these new approaches really do benefit offenders in prevention of reoffending. Next module, we're going to look at what that means for the victims as well.